Hey, friend. August here with a quick note before we begin. If you're struggling in light of the election in the US, I am sending you so much love and care. At the episode's end, after the outro music, keep listening for a short bonus segment that I hope will bring you some light. What would it take to arouse your life, to experience more connection, more pleasure, more realness in and outside of the bedroom? I'm August McLaughlin, and this is Girl Boner Radio.
And people have asked, do you regret having an affair? No, but I wish I had been more forthcoming with my ex.
I do regret hurting someone that I love. I wish that I had done it differently. It was and still is hard to reflect on how much pain I was in and then how I was experiencing so much joy, but it was a secret.
Julia and Jeremiah are certified sex therapists and co-hosts of the podcast Sexvangelicals. They feel it's part of their work as therapists to talk about taboo subjects like sex and infidelity. By talking about their own experiences with both, they hope others will feel less alone, and their path sheds so much light on the complexities that often surround affairs, especially for folks who grew up deeply religious as they both did. So we will touch on topics that may be sensitive for some. As always, please take care while listening.
I'll start. I grew up in a conservative Christian household. There were lots of messages around doing the right thing. I don't remember explicit messages around purity culture values. My dad was often naked. And I remember being like, Dad, what are you doing? Put clothes on. My dad is a funny mix of very religious, but also wild child, redneck, hippie. I remember really, really internalizing that and feeling super uncomfortable by that. I think that that's connected with messages from the church around presenting yourself in a way that is appealing before the Lord. So I have always had a little bit of a history of anxiety around my body, especially growing up as a boy, growing up as a guy, growing up with other guys. I was always one of the smaller people and picked up pretty quick on popularity was given to those who are the most athletic, those who kind of had the best control over their body, and I never really did.
Jeremiah was adopted, which influenced those things too.
So I'm ethnic Hispanic, grew up in a white family. My body was different from a lot of the other kids that I grew up with, which kind of fit into this larger version of what do I need to do to pass as a white kid?
So Jeremiah laid low and relied on his intelligence.
And thinking my way through things as a way of getting attention from other people in my life.
Julia did grow up with overt purity culture messaging, especially around modesty, the state of being unassuming or moderate in things like appearance.
As a young girl, modesty was a huge value within my religious community. So modesty was a part of my vocabulary before I actually had a consciousness or an actual definition of what that might be. The narrative that I received was that I, as a girl and a prepubescent girl, needed to protect both myself and protect older adult men from the sin of lust by ensuring that I was as covered as possible. The interpretation was men are mentally raping you all the time. They can't control that, so you have to be the gatekeeper of that. I remember even at the age of 8, 9, having conversations with my friends about whether or not spaghetti straps were sinful. And these were serious conversations that I had with my peers. In high school, I bought jeans that were probably at least 4 sizes too big for me because I knew that if clothes touched my body in a way that anybody could see the outline of my body, that was dangerous and that was sinful. I learned that God made men to be sexual creatures, and that was something that they were simultaneously supposed to fight outside of a married context, but it was also exactly how God wanted them to be. So modesty actually had a bit of a higher calling. Being modest was something that was important to me. I felt like I was doing the right thing.
Jeremiah and Julia both learned very limited and confusing things about sex.
Interestingly, I think my dad did the best that he could talking with me about sex. There were some awkward conversations, and I think the way that he tried to talk with me about sexuality was not the way that I would do it, but at least he tried. So he made reference to condoms. He never called them condoms. I think he used the word raincoat. That's the word that's sticking out in my mind. Obviously, never showed me how to use them or anything like that. Part of the ideas about sex that I learned was that if I had sex, I massively increased the chances of getting someone pregnant because we didn't talk about contraceptives. And then also, if I have sex with someone, I'm going to put someone in a situation like my birth mother who gets presented as like this victim in all of this. And well, I don't want to do that. So I'll go so far in romantic relationships, but I don't want to move into anything sexual.
Julia went to a private school that was more like a homeschooling co-op, she said. She went to class in a rented building and graduated with 3 other people.
I did not have any formal sex education. I definitely received messaging explicitly and implicitly through my school, church, and camp about sexuality. And by sexuality, I specifically mean purity culture. Since before I can remember, I asked my mom what sex was probably when I was about 7, and I remember having a lot of panic about it. I remember crying and feeling panicked. And I had this idea that I know it's bad and wrong, and I shouldn't know what it is, but I want to know what it is. So I was always very curious about sexuality. And in my adolescent years, very eager to have sexual experiences, but those were off limits. And I was not having sexual experiences. I wanted to be having sexual experiences, but I certainly would never tell anyone about that because I also learned that as a woman, I didn't really have any kind of sexual desire, that my role was to be a sexual outlet for the man that I married.
Wow. So you knew you had, maybe without thinking the words, but you felt a desire.
Yes.
And you also felt the need to keep it private and maybe push it down, it
Yes.
sounds like.
And I didn't have any kind of sexual arousal that I can remember, which is important because I didn't actually have any information. All I knew growing up is that I wanted to have this experience that I didn't really know what it was. I learned that sex was vaginally penetrative intercourse, but I didn't know what a penis looked like. I didn't know about erections. I didn't know where my own vagina was. So even the parts that I did know, I didn't know. And I had this desire for something, but I couldn't really name it.
Jeremiah continued on his religious path in early adulthood, which continued to impact his sexuality.
I started working at a church when I was 20. I ended up leading worship. In my 20s, my first career is in worship ministry. Any sort of interactions around sexuality that I individually had, I kind of had that in the back of my mind. What do good religious leaders do? And if I am establishing myself as a quote religious leader, whatever that means when you're 19 or 20, how does that inform the way that I do relationships? The Church of Christ, which is the denomination I was a part of, there were some ways that it very, very explicitly engaged in the edicts of purity culture in the 90s and in the early 2000s. There were also some ways that, oh, well, purity rings, purity pledges, like that's something that the Baptists do. The churches that I went to didn't really go in that direction. They used kind of coded language that represented purity culture. The university definitely, specifically women who got pregnant, routinely expelled and kind of shunted those women aside. Like I had picked up on messages that men are visual creatures, men are sexual creatures, and as such, they are dangerous. And I don't want to be that.
So you tried to shut that part down, it sounds like?
For sure, in public senses, absolutely. There were ways that I explored that in private senses behind closed doors.
Did you have a strong sense of faith? Maybe that's an obvious.
Oh,
Maybe not, though.
no,
Did you just feel like you should be a leader in a church?
it was much more the former. Like that's one of the ways that I got recognition was stepping into leadership roles.
He picked up on that super early. He remembers a specific time.
I'm a 7-year-old boy. I'm in a small group with a bunch of women, and none of the other like men show up to this. So I'm the only boy, and so I have adult women saying, "Jeremiah, like you're the boy, you're the man. Like you lead the songs, you lead the scriptures," and me being the compliant oldest adopted kid, being like, "You got it," with gusto.
And that gusto, he said, carried over for 30 plus years. It was more about fitting in for him, being considered good in the culture, than a spiritual experience. For Julia, there was a lot of expectation and pressure to save herself for her husband, of course, meaning sex. And unlike Jeremiah, her faith was a hugely important part of her life.
I actually never had a purity ring. I'm shocked because it was probably the most important part of my life. Being a good Christian girl, which translated specifically to girl who is pure, was everything about me to a large degree. Even the successes that I had academically or in other contexts all pointed back to who I was as this pure person. On one hand, performing purity culture was a way to garner attention and success, but I also believed it. My prayer life, my memorization of scripture, the ways that I was boldly a Christian when I worked at Applebee's, which was really my first time encountering quote unquote non-believers, was a big part of my identity. So probably anyone who knew me knew that Christianity and purity culture and not dating and not having sexual experiences was high.
In young adulthood, some years before they met, Julia met someone, fell in love, and got married. And Jeremiah met someone, fell in love, and got married. By then, Julia really started questioning her religious roots for the first time.
Which is interesting because I went to a Christian college. However, I was in the liberal pocket of a Christian school because my background was in sociology and social work. However, I really didn't unpack sexuality. I thought I unpacked sexuality because it then became really important to go to LGBTQ affirming churches and churches that were committed to anti-racism. So I had this idea that I've unpacked the harmful parts of my religious roots. But when I got married and when I was dating and engaged, I was still very much within communities that were highly prioritizing purity.
I got married at 24. The woman that I married and I dated for 5 years because one of the things that did carry over from our school with other Christian schools is the ring by spring.
Ring by spring is this thing in some Christian colleges where students aim to get engaged before graduation.
And my ex and I wanted to push back against that. We're not going to be an ACU statistic. We're going to wait till we're 24. Good one. Early 20-something-year-old us.
Before the couple got married, the relationship became sexual and complicated.
One of our earliest sexual experiences was actually about 4 weeks into our relationship at her family's house. Things were building, and then her dad walked in. She grew up in a Southern Baptist community that's very dedicated to the values of purity culture. And the result was bad. He unleashed in some sort of a way on her, yelled at me for a little bit. And I wonder if that event had not happened, how different our relationship might have been. I think that was a turning point in the relationship. And that's 4 weeks into the relationship. And remember, we dated 5 years. So we continued to have sexual experiences, although following the laws of purity culture, we kept our clothes on and all those like good appearing types of things. We would have sexual experiences. We would both orgasm. And then she would begin to shake. She would begin to cry. She would begin to apologize. Hey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And in my mind, I'm thinking, like, why are you apologizing for? Like, okay, like, whatever. There's another part of me that's like, oh, this person that I love deeply is also hurt. So I'm just like holding on for dear life, trying to like get the shakes to stop so we could have some sort of a connecting point.
Jeremiah did not have the language for it at the time, but today he realizes that she was having panic attacks.
And that happened easily 50 times over the course of 3 or 4 years. Those types of experiences really were punctuated throughout our dating experience and built and built and built. Even once we got married, we were never able to talk about it. As we talk about in relationship therapy, when you don't talk about things directly, shit comes out sideways.
Julia's would-be marriage essentially started out as a courtship.
I don't think we specifically called it that, but that's what it was. I learned that you only date with the intention to get married. So after a first date, 3 tops, you've got to know that this is the person that you want to commit your life to, which is a lot of pressure on a relationship.
They dated for 6 months.
Not a particularly wise decision, but it was everything that I knew. And it was applauded. Nobody asked, is this exactly what you want? Or some version of that. Now, if somebody had, I don't think it would have made a difference because I was so entrenched, I'll even say indoctrinated to the values of purity culture, that I would have held steadfast in the decision to get married when I did and probably have a lot of pride in it.
Jeremiah's marriage started out on a high note.
We get married. The first couple of months, I would even say probably the first 6 months were really positive. We lived in the town that we went to school. We had friends there. We had good sexual experiences. At least I had good sexual experiences. I think that my partner had good sexual experiences. I don't know what the turning point was, but at some point, the dynamic of that changed. My ex would say things like, oh, well, Jeremiah, all you think about is sex. Oh, well, you just want sex all the time. And would be making these types of kind of anger, rage-based comments towards my sexuality, which was, one, not true. Like, I don't think about sex all the time. I work with a bunch of sex therapists, and I'm probably on the lower end of thinking about sex compared to most of the people that I work with. And 2, it also reinforced this idea of, oh, like, no matter how hard I try to be a good person and to like not be those guys, not be those dangerous white men that we're railing on in the last 10 to 15 years, like it doesn't matter. Over time, that became weaponized. And because I wanted to be a good person, I didn't know how to like respond to that. So I would shut down. I didn't help myself in some ways. I was always kind to my ex. I wasn't an especially helpful partner. So there were definitely ways that I contributed to the downfall of the relationship, the avoidance of the relationship.
Meanwhile, Jeremiah was studying relationship therapy. One day, his boss asked him to join the sex therapy program he was running, and he said it would be subsidized for him, so basically free. So Jeremiah sort of fell into his sex therapy career path, and immediately, it was eye-opening.
The first class that we had was about the values of sex therapy. So consent, non-exploitation, honesty, shared values, contraception, mutual pleasure.
Something big dawned on him.
I haven't talked about any of that. Oh, fuck. I have been doing this wrong. The sexual experiences that we've had have just been for the sake of like doing sex. If I ever tried to talk about sex, a panic would come back up. And so I came home and I was like, I need to apologize to you because the way that we have been doing sex is like terrible. And she's like, okay, well, it's no big deal. That interaction for me kind of became a kind of a fork in the road where our paths began to diverge in some really interesting ways. I began to study more about sexuality, have conversations with other people about sexuality. I think her resentment began to build. I got treated in some pretty poor ways over the course of the next few years. At a certain point, realized I don't think this relationship is tenable anymore. I said, hey, I really want to go to couples therapy. She rejected it. She denied it.
Jeremiah also realized that while he was exploring sex academically, she was exploring it with someone else.
There was a man that she was hanging out with for some time, would like hang out late. We were driving somewhere. I had peeked over into her phone. We were like ordering coffee, and I saw like her message pop up, and this guy that I knew said, hey, love you. And I said, what's this? And oh, it's no big deal. And I'm like, okay, like this is an affair, like good for you, even though she would continue to deny it. There was never any time that I tried to initiate conversations about sexuality. The same patterns that happened early in the relationship, the panic attacks returned, the criticism of me returned. It was really, really difficult.
When Julia's relationship with her ex started out, she said they flirted with the line of what's too far or not enough in terms of sex.
And what I've noticed with folks in purity culture is that there's two versions of this. There is the version in which you essentially do everything but penetrative sex and all good. Or you have the version of my story, which was more competitive.
Trying to be the purest possible. For example, during Julia's teens, her youth pastor didn't kiss her husband until they were at the altar, and she was glorified for that.
So for me, it wasn't just, oh, we save this specific sex act for marriage. We are trying to avoid almost anything aside from hand holding. Now, when I first started dating my ex-husband, we were having all these sexual experiences that were wonderful, but both of us, especially me, were racked with all kinds of guilt and shame. And so we decided that we just needed to stop being sexual at all in order to preserve this purity that was so important to both of us. So after maybe just a couple months of dating, we completely de-eroticized our relationship. At the time, I thought, I'm protecting myself, I'm protecting this relationship so that we can have the best sexuality possible.
But completely de-eroticizing the relationship sort of did the opposite once they said, I do.
I couldn't recover. We couldn't recover. I grew up with this very mythical narrative around your wedding night sex and honeymoon sex. And it was simultaneously the best experience of your entire life. But also, if you did it right, sex was going to get better and better. And I was completely disillusioned. I was completely heartbroken. My world really crumbled after I got married. And some people, well-intentioned, have questioned that. They've said, I mean, it was just sex, right? And the rest of your relationship was good. So why was it that big of a deal? And what I say is that it wasn't just sex. It was my entire world. My entire world was building to this point. This was my whole identity. And then this thing that was the most important part of our relationship and our life was physically and emotionally painful. I cried every single day of my honeymoon and pretty frequently after that. So my world crashed after I got married.
Still, she didn't question her faith or the religious teachings that she'd been abiding by for a long time.
Initially, my perspective and the perspective of my ex-husband was that we are going to pray through this. We saw a Christian counselor before we saw a sex therapist. We asked people to pray for us. We prayed before we engaged in sex. And that actually just further disillusioned me and further broke my heart.
I didn't know this, by the way.
Oh, yeah. We were a part of a Vineyard Church, which is this strange combination of Pentecostal and evangelical. And they were doing this leap of faith event in which you were supposed to pray for something really specific and ask for a miracle. And my miracle was my sex life, that I could finally be out of pain and enjoy it, which did not happen. And when I did go to sex therapy for the first time, she asked me about my background. And I remember saying, well, I grew up in this very insular type of community, highly religious, but I don't think it impacted my sexuality at all. And I had no idea that it was probably the most impactful part of my sexuality.
That was over 2 years into the marriage when they found a sex therapist who had an understanding of religion and purity culture. By then, Julia said, so much damage had been done.
And who knows? Maybe if we had stayed married, we could have recovered. I don't know. I suspect not. And sometimes the relationship doesn't survive it.
Right.
Did you know that sex toys can make orgasms last longer? They also make big O's more likely if you've struggled in that department. Whether you use a toy alone or with a partner, I highly recommend having at least one that you love. If you want to stock up on toys or your favorite lube, or get a really fancy designer one, you can get free, always discreet shipping on orders over $75 at The Pleasure Chest. Simply head to thepleasurechest.com and search by category for vibrators, strap-ons, kink accessories, toys for couples, and more. Basically, you can build your own pleasure chest by shopping at thepleasurechest.com. The therapist who was so helpful planted the seed for Julia to pursue sex therapy as a career. She said,
if you decide to become a sex therapist, I think you'd be a great sex therapist. And that was really inspiring to me. But when I did study sex therapy training at the University of Michigan, those were like the Jenga blocks that dislodged the whole tower.
When they were both in sex therapy training, Julia and Jeremiah had the same supervisor. They were both still married to their exes at the time.
I met Jeremiah through the supervisor, and we met for a collegial coffee, which is super common for therapists. I really enjoyed meeting Jeremiah, and I remember thinking how great it would be to have a friend who could understand some of my experiences. We were both sex therapists, and we learned at the end of the coffee date that we had different yet similar religious upbringings. And in Boston, there actually are a lot of phenomenal sex therapists. Many of them don't have either experiential or academic training around how religious fundamentalism can impact sexuality. So it was like that time when you meet someone and you're like, oh, you get it. Oh, you get it. I don't have to explain it to you.
Jeremiah felt that way too. Not just that they got each other, but also
the centrality with which we could potentially kind of hold moving out of religious spaces and also helping other people move out of some of the damaging messages of religious spaces was important for both of us as well. I'm like, oh, this could be like someone that I could bounce some ideas off of, and we could potentially like partner and collaborate in the future. And at the time I was just thinking about professional collaboration. I had no idea the expansiveness to which collaboration could happen.
soon the expansiveness grew in a personal direction.
Probably the second or third time we saw each other, the vibe was a bit flirtatious, but not heavily so. And I have many people in my life who have more flirtatious personalities, even when they're not necessarily sexual. So I clocked it as a bit flirtatious, and I definitely sensed an attraction, but I didn't make any assumptions about it.
Then they started sexting each other. It started out silly, like, let's see what kind of ridiculous sex things we could say. And over the holidays, it became like a game.
I was with my in-laws navigating conservative Christmas. I had actually just been fired by a church for my perspectives on sexuality.
The game went like this.
For every obnoxious thing we hear a preacher say, let's send each other a sext, just to kind of like be humorous about this.
Then Jeremiah's wife got into his phone.
And saw all of these sex that happened and came into the bedroom like freaking out, like, what is this? In tears.
While she herself had been having an affair, she was still really hurt by what she found. So Jeremiah explained, or tried to.
It's a funny game that we're playing. But the more that I begin to think about it, the more I'm like, well, I already don't see a way forward in this relationship.
Julia was in a tough place with her marriage then, too.
I was avoiding that I didn't want to be married.
A few months into their sexting flirtations, things became physical.
I didn't share that my husband and I were not in an open relationship at the time. We had previously had a short stint in which that was a part of our relationship.
Julia knew Jeremiah was married, but did not know if he and his wife were in an open relationship. They didn't discuss any relationship agreements. They just knew they wanted to bring their emotional flirtations to bed.
So we made plans to have a sexual experience. We had a sexual experience. We talked about it. And we both said after the fact that no, our spouses didn't know what we were doing that day.
Interesting. Did you not want to know the answers? Were you just, I just want to do this and see how it feels?
I don't think I cared. And that sounds really callous. But if I had known in advance that you and your ex-wife didn't have an agreement around this, I still would have done it.
Yeah, same here.
Soon after, Jeremiah felt the need for honesty at home.
I realized that I needed to tell my ex. The evening that I planned on doing that, I'm like, okay, like I'm also seeing like our supervisor. I'm like, okay, I need to tell Joe this is what's going on. And so I'm like concocting, like preparing myself, driving over to his office.
Jeremiah arrives and walks in.
Joe's like, how are you doing? And Joe's this like mid-50s bear from East Boston. I sit down and say, hey, Joe, I want to talk to you about something. Doesn't skip a beat. You fucking Julia? And I'm like, yes, thank you. Let's talk about this. And so, like, I appreciate his directness with that, first of all. And then also his kindness towards me in that. I had also expected to get some negativity from religious spaces.
Yeah, he had been kicked out of the religious community by then, but still, Joe's kindness gave him the confidence to talk to his ex.
I refer to this as Truth Day, where I said, hey, I need to talk with you. You know this girl, Julia. We are having sex. I think we had sex 2 or 3 times at that stage, maybe twice. And she said, I'm having an affair with this guy. I said, I know that you are. You told me that you weren't, but I knew that you were. And that day is also like really, really sad because I think that was the day that we were the most honest with each other, my ex and I. And I think that is the only time that we talked about sex in ways that didn't bring up anxiety. I talked about some of the ways that I was thinking about sex and sexuality. She was too. There wasn't a ton of defensiveness. And then the next day, it was business as usual, unfortunately. She did some pretty ugly things in the 10 months that followed between the separation and the divorce. Disclosing the affair was also like the last kind of close experience that I had with my ex.
Meanwhile, Julia and Jeremiah had conversations about what they wanted their relationship to look like. They made a mutual decision.
Like, I want you in my life. I want you to play a role in my life in some capacity. Don't know what that means, but like, let's keep meeting up.
They continued going on walks and having lunch together. And a few months after Jeremiah's Truth Day with his wife, Julia disclosed the affair in couples therapy with her husband.
I knew that as soon as I told my ex-husband that our relationship would be over, and some relationships can survive an affair, some can't. I knew that it would be a deal breaker for him, which I absolutely respect. However, I did and still have a lot of love and affection for that relationship. I was both really heartbroken and also scared to leave it. So it was a very difficult day.
Neither Julia nor Jeremiah regret starting their relationship when they did, but they do regret parts of how everything unfolded.
When I look back, I wish I had been more forthcoming with my ex. I had actually decided probably 2 or 3 months before that, like, divorce is probably going to be the way that this ends. And I need to figure out a way to initiate that. And if I could have done it differently, I would have been more direct in talking with my ex about that. I love our story. I love the ways that we connect. We had and continue to have, Julia, such a fun time. And people have asked, like, do you regret having an affair? No, but I wish I had been more forthcoming with my ex and saying, like, hey, like, if you aren't willing to do couples therapy with me, this is over.
Admitting the affair to her therapist and then husband was really scary for Julia.
I accurately predicted that I temporarily lost most of my family and many friends, other community, to some degree, some financial security as well. I had a career and I had a very good career, but being a private practice therapist, I had no benefits, I had no insurance. There was a lot in my marriage and outside of my marriage that I was going to lose. The religious shame that I accurately predicted would come was the thing that kept me married for a longer period of time. I also don't regret having an affair, which is a thing that probably many people will understandably bristle at. I do regret hurting someone that I love.
Yeah.
I wish that I had done it differently. And theoretically, I could have. But knowing where I was at developmentally, I suspect that it probably would have been an affair at some point. That was probably going to be my entryway out, because I don't think I would have been able to leave unless I had been able to taste that something could be different.
Beyond their personal experience, Julia and Jeremiah have explored the topic of infidelity as clinicians, which paired together brings up interesting points about religious versus non-religious couples.
When we set in the study of infidelity, most people actually who have affairs don't actually want to leave their primary relationships. So our story is in the minority. I don't know if that's true specifically for religious couples, however, because the thing that for both of us that we were both trying to avoid is the idea of divorce. Because in religious land and evangelical land, divorce is one of the worst things that you can do. For me, it was about, okay, like, if I am the one that initiates kind of ending this relationship, am I going to end up looking like the bad guy? On top of all the, like, financial loss, the cultural loss. My ex had, like, the insurance, she had a rich family, like all that stuff. But there was also kind of the cultural shame of continuing to, like, not want to be the bad guy and seeing and avoiding that in a direct kind of way.
And I had experienced firsthand growing up what happens when women have affairs. My very close friend's mother had an affair, and I was at my friend's house when the mother disclosed it. By the next day, when I came home from the sleepover, the entire community and multiple communities knew about this. This affair was on the prayer chain. My friend's mother ended up being in a psychiatric ward for suicidal ideation. That cemented to me how much absolute, even deeper than shame, like ostracization?
Sure.
Like the
I'm saying,
absolute like humiliation and shaming of a woman when she makes a choice. And I think probably people could misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that people necessarily have affairs. I don't think it is a great idea for all kinds of reasons. And people do make those choices. And the ways that people are treated within religious communities are horrendous. This woman was barred from communion, which for those who grew up in religious backgrounds know that that's how you connect with God. So this choice to have a sexual experience outside of her marriage barred her from God. I suspect people in my community know that I had an affair. It's probably an open secret. I suspect that people know that the divorce was connected to an affair. But yes, having affairs and getting divorced were the worst things that a person could do, especially a woman could do.
Yeah.
And I knew that by getting divorced, that I was going to potentially be in exactly the same position that like I had witnessed firsthand.
I so appreciate everything you're sharing. I think context is something that's so missing. When people hear about affairs, it's almost like headliney. We hear so-and-so did this and so-and-so, and there's always context, whether they're trying to leave a relationship or not. And even if people bristle at the idea of not regretting an affair, I feel like with this context, it doesn't have to be like the quote unquote right or ideal thing. It could still be the brave
Sure.
thing. Like it sounds to me like you were both really courageous. You had to stand up against all of these beliefs and what ifs and these dangers
Yeah.
for love and to have like a richer, truer life that is more spiritual if you use those terms, you
Yeah.
Well,
know?
and some of the ways that we connected in the first like 6 months, 9 months, traveling, hiking, walking, eating good foods, like those are things that we've continued to maintain throughout the 6 years of our relationship that I've really enjoyed. And so these things that I like discovered also about myself. Oh, I really like to walk stupid distances in the course of one day. One of the first times we met up, we went to New York together. I think I walked like 20 miles to New York City that day. Loved it, loved it, loved it. That's something we've continued to do and to build on. So this isn't a relationship in which like we had these really kind of cool bonding experiences and then like 2 to 3 years later those go away. We've built on those over the course of our relationship in some really beautiful, meaningful ways.
But it was hard because it was the first time in my adult life that I felt good sexually, that I felt good about my body. And it was so hard to experience joy in a way that I never had my entire life and not be able to talk about it. I have some friends who, in retrospect, know that we had an affair and they have chosen not to be a part of my life. It was and still is hard to reflect on how much pain I was in and then how I was experiencing so much joy. But it was a secret,
Yeah,
aside
the
from my
isolation.
therapist and two very close friends. Even though I didn't think that I was doing the worst thing imaginable, a lot of people did, and a lot of people still do. I don't blame the church for having an affair. It was a choice that I made with insight. That being said, I do say that my religious upbringing set me up to fail in my marriage and set me up to make a choice and to have one of those choices be an affair. And then the same system that set me up to have that really awful choice then shamed me.
Julia and Jeremiah have now been together for about 6 years. They approach their relationship very differently from their marriages. They've both learned a lot and continue to learn, and they continue to apply the lessons.
For me, it is being able to communicate when I am upset by something or when something is off. I'm not great at it. I think being willing to take risks and to communicate like what's happening for me and then what my needs are and being able to practice that. It is a practice. I hope that I'm better at this in 5 years. It's a practice that I'm committed to. I appreciate that even though I piss Julia off sometimes, there's also an understanding and a celebration from Julia that I am practicing being a different person.
Julia has said to him,
Like, oh, Jeremiah, I want you to tell me what's going on. You have a history of swallowing your needs, of swallowing your feelings and it coming out sideways. I don't want that for you. and then being able to trust that and step into that.
He feels these are things we can all take to heart.
I work with
Yeah.
so many couples who have such high expectations on themselves to like get it perfectly. And as soon as things derail a little bit, they like throw a grenade into the situation and completely like decompensate and then begin like beating themselves up or any number of things. I would encourage folks to remember that communication is an ongoing practice.
Julia values how she and Jeremiah navigate conflicts.
In many ways, my ex-husband and I engaged conflict pretty well. I'm glad that we went to therapy twice when we did. Even though the relationship ended, I learned quite a bit from those experiences. Towards the end of the relationship, though, the conflict that we needed to have around our relationship and around sexuality ultimately did break the relationship. That wasn't conflict that our relationship could hold because our worldviews, wants, goals, and dreams had shifted in other kinds of directions. One of many things that's meaningful in this relationship is that when we do have conflict, it doesn't hold the same level of fear. Even in conflicts that are less productive, I have a deep trust that we will come back to each other and resolve and heal and reconcile. Now, hopefully, we'll have more productive conflict than unproductive conflict, but all relationships have unproductive conflict. And I don't feel as much distress and fear about the relationship. I have distress, fear, and shame about myself, and I'm still working through that. But I have so much confidence in the relationship. And especially from religious backgrounds, conflict in a relationship, in a marriage, or a partnership holds quite a bit of stigma. The default is to avoid conflict. And if you're not having conflict, then you're a healthy couple. I'm glad that we can engage conflict in the way that we do.
Jeremiah agrees and said he has learned a lot from Julia about this.
If that's solving a problem around parenting, if that's trying to communicate something about yourself, if that's a sexual experience, like knowing that they are simultaneously like singular episodic things and that they are also ongoing interactions that you can come back to. And we do really well at coming back to things, even if we get stuck, even if I become completely overwhelmed and blow my top, or if you shut down, or kind of whatever that is, there is a trust and both an implicit expectation, but also an explicit statement that we will like come back, and that we do. We come back to each other.
Julia and Jeremiah talked a bit about their affair on their podcast, Sex Evangelicals. They open one of the episodes checking in with each other. They were about to talk about this really personal, difficult topic. Still, they feel it's important to have such conversations, and they felt it was worth exploring and sharing their story for you all, too.
If strangers listen to this podcast or our podcast, I have zero concerns whatsoever talking about having an affair. I do have fear and anxiety when I think about the people close to me knowing about an affair. I think that it's important because affairs are misunderstood.
Yeah.
I am hoping in the future to write a book that could be part memoir, but part qualitative research about women in religious contexts who have affairs. Affairs are very, very common. And I wouldn't want anyone to feel alone in the way that I did. And I can hold nuance for the ways that an affair hurts another partner or partners. And I can hold empathy for how devastating that would be. I know that I deeply, deeply wounded my ex-partner, and that will always be a hurt that he carries. I can have a huge amount of empathy for that, and I can hold space for the complicated decision that I made. I just would want other people to know that they are not a broken or a bad person for making a choice that could hurt someone else.
On top of that, part of our work as sex therapists, as relationship coaches, is to talk about taboo things, is to name things that our culture, for whatever reason, has told us not to talk about. Sex is one of those things, obviously, but there's a lot of different subcategories within sexuality as well. And I would suggest that infidelity is one of those subcategories. We want to communicate to other people that in working with us, anything's on the table, and that we're going to do 99% of the time, with the exception of non-consensual abuse, we're going to do whatever we can to accept that type of behavior and to accept what you bring into the room with us and to be able to hold that. And we have the responsibility in some ways to model that. For me, talking explicitly about infidelity and talking explicitly about sexuality and other elements of my story kind of sets that precedent that, my space is a safe space, that Julia, your space is a safe space to talk about really hard things.
Affairs don't just happen. We talk about the complexity of choosing to have an affair, but affairs also don't just happen in the sense that two people make a choice outside of a context. All kinds of contextual factors can contribute to an affair, and those are worth exploring. The affair is usually the outcome of a whole host of other stuff that has or is happening. And I don't know how I would have survived having an affair and a divorce without a therapist who could hold that non-judgmentally, because even in the world of therapy, affairs hold a huge amount of stigma. And I wasn't looking for my therapist to tell me that it was a great idea that I was having an affair. She didn't need to say, "You go, girl." But I did need someone to be able to hold me and my story without judgment. And I remember the first time that I had disclosed the affair to my therapist, and she knew it was in the works. She wasn't surprised, but I was watching her so closely because Jeremiah knows sometimes I pick up on body language too quickly. And it was one of the most healing experiences of my life to be in the room with this other woman and disclose this thing that I learned was the worst thing I could do, and have her look at me and say, "Okay, we're going to figure this out."
Yeah.
To learn more from Jeremiah and Julia, check out Sex Evangelicals, where they provide sex education the church didn't want you to have, on your favorite podcast app. Subscribe to their Substack, Relationship 101, for twice-a-week newsletters about the research of communication, relationships, and sexuality. To inquire about individual coaching with either of them, send an email to sexevangelicals@gmail.com. If you're enjoying Girl Boner Radio, a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts would mean so much to me. I would also love it if you would share links with your friends. Thanks so much for listening. So after the election results came in, which was just the other day as I record this, I felt like so many of you, heartbroken, sad, angry, grief-stricken, a little numb, nauseous. The list goes on. I guess I wanted everyone to know that I'm not giving up, and I hope that you will not either. Back in 2016, I recall having more of these kinds of feelings with more hopelessness during round 1 of whatever we call this. And for the first time, I really considered quitting almost everything I do. It was you all who inspired me to keep going, and doing this work and keeping on, especially producing this show, really helped me more than I can say. We can't change reality. That's something that I think about a lot. But we can decide how we respond to it. And I believe that involves kindness in our everyday lives, and music and art and nature and animals and pleasure in whatever ways we can find it. That is so, so powerful. With that in mind, I'm going to leave you with a clip from a 2017 episode with musician Michelle Mangione. She and Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane, she's an icon, joined me in conversation, which we recorded live. It was during the aftermath of several hurricanes, and Michelle was doing incredible advocacy, raising money. And our theme was music through storms, which feels so relevant right now. So here is Michelle performing the song Rise Up and playing all of the instruments. She's incredible. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that we can all do things in our everyday lives, and that's powerful. It means a lot. So please keep taking care of yourself. Reach out for support if you need it. And listen to this song, Rise Up. I hope you enjoy it. When we are experiencing that kind of hopelessness that is hard not to feel, when we see the headlines and we see the news, whether we've been through it or not, it can feel like, what can we do? Does the creative process help you both therapeutically for yourself? Just knowing that you're able to make some effort, do you find that that's something that you recommend to people to tap into?
Oh, God, yes. I'm hoping that this will inspire kids to write a song, even if they want to write about, maybe it'll give them something to write about or to write for, And I'm hoping that kids that have been affected by these storms, I would love to be able to just fly over and help them record and play and write and do anything I could. I would love to be able to do that. But the other thing is, when I think about what you just asked me to think about, and you could probably relate to this, that so many of us can remember songs, how music at one point gave us hope. Whatever it was, whether we were going through a breakup or devastation or fire or whatever it was, I've had people come up to me and say, God, this song, thank you, because I was going through blah, 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 and this song just happened to be on my car stereo. And it helped me through it. And that, to me, is like, I get goosebumps, I think about that.
Yeah,
so
you never know how it's going to affect someone.
Right. You never know. Yeah. You never know.
I remember going through a breakup, a really rough one, and my sister sent me this mix CD. It was one of the most helpful things. Knowing that she put it together, and I could hear how much thoughtfulness, because every song had a particular message. And anytime I hear any one of those songs, it brings me back to that feeling of feeling supported.
Right.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is completely putting you on the spot, but would you be up for jamming just for a minute?
Sure.
Live?
Sure.
Okay. I'd love to hear something.
I have to grab my guitar.
Go for it.
All right, cool. All right.
You are just a one-person band. I love it. You guys, this is one person. I'm not doing any part of this.
Are we on right now?
We're on.
Oh, shit. Okay, sorry. All right, so this is just a little piece of the Edge of Madness. Who will hear our story? Who will see this hell? Who will bring us justice? Tell me, who will? station in Baton Rouge as a train to Crescent City. Bourbon Street keeps calling him back to a Cajun girl so pretty. Old men sit outside the bars, tell stories they can't forget. Songs fly up to the evening stars on distant clarinets. But now she sees the sorrow and the anger of the crowd. She says, rise up for tomorrow. Stand together